Chapter 13. The peace that had been so rudely disturbed was only with difficulty regained. The marbles found it hard to settle down once more into the old groove. And no sooner had they begun to do so than another interruption to their peace, if their panic-stricken existence can be so called, occurred, this time at the hands of a more dangerous person, Madame Collins. She had come to the limit of her patience. Nearly 6 months had elapsed since she had paid into her account a little roll of banknotes, which might have been traced, had anyone taken the trouble, to Mr. Marble. After that last terrible occurrence, when that silly boy John had met with the motorcycling accident, she had indeed been content to wait a while, until matters should be quieter again, but this wait was too long altogether. Dressmaking in a back street in Dulwich, with an automaton of a husband, began to annoy her exceedingly. Anything was better than that, she decided. Even at Christmas time she had meditated action, but Winnie had been there when she called, and Winnie had looked her up and down with cool insolence, and even Marguerite Collins had been abashed, or rather, had decided that it would be better if Winnie were not her enemy. She bided her time awaiting a more favorable moment. One morning Mr. Marble was alone at home, for Annie had gone out on one of her all too infrequent shopping expeditions. She had been gone 5 minutes only, when to Marble's ear came the familiar sound of her hurried, quiet knock. With an enormous effort, everything was a great deal of trouble nowadays, he heaved himself out of his chair and went to the door. Marguerite Collins was determined to have no nonsense. As the door opened she stepped inside, and she was through into the drawing room and sitting down before Marble had shut it again. Marble came and stood before her wearily and dull-wittedly. There was clearly going to be trouble, and Mr. Marble did not feel in the mood for trouble. "Well, what is it?" asked Marble. Marguerite did not answer at once. She threw back the fur from round her neck and drew off her gloves with slow, deliberate movements. With a gesture she made much of her round, white throat and her plump hands. 6 months ago this alone would have stirred Marble into action, but now it left him unmoved. Those 6 months had been spent in sluggish overdrinking and in frothy anxiety. Besides, he had had his will of her, and Marguerite was not of the type to revive dead passion. All this Marguerite realized as she watched, keenly but covertly, his unshaved face and the expressionless blue eyes. It was as she feared. Well, it would have to be pure business, then, without the frail disguise of anything else. "You are not pleased that I come to see you?" she asked, with the lisp and trace of accent that Marble had once thought so wonderful. "No," said Marble, in no mood for tact. As a matter of fact, he was rapidly growing incapable of thinking about anything save what lay outside under the soil of the dreary backyard. But the monosyllable roused Madame Collins to fury. It hurt, the more so as she had realized it previously. "You are not polite," she said, a faint flush appearing on her soft, over-soft, cheeks. "No," said Marble. "You admit it. Are you not ashamed? And do you not remember when you would not have said a thing like that to me? No, not for worlds." "No," said Marble. "No. Have you nothing else to say to me except no?" "No," said Marble. He could hardly be said to be intentionally rude, but a man whose mind chooses that particular moment to run off on its favorite track towards arrest and execution is in no fit state to argue any point whatever with a hot-tempered woman, especially when he is in the wrong. Marguerite Collins bit her lips and then restrained herself by a violent effort of will. After all, money, so said her peasant soul to herself, was sweeter than revenge at any time, sweet though they both were. If she could obtain no money, then perhaps she could have the other. But she would spare no effort to screw more money out of this weak-minded rentier first. She spoke calmly, and she allowed just as much of the old sweetness to creep into her tone as she thought might soften Marble towards her. "Listen, Will. I am in trouble. I am in great trouble. My husband, you know what he is, I have told you, oh, so often. He is unsupportable. I hate him. And now I think he hates me also. I must leave him. I must go away. I shall go back to Normandy, to Rouen. But I must have money. He has none. No more have I. Will, dear." Marble made one of the greatest mistakes of his life when he said no for the 5th time that morning. The flush on Marguerite's cheeks became deeper. She was scarlet with indignation. It is doubtful why Marble should have said it. A single one of those unspent hundreds from his annual income would have ended the matter for the time. But the refusal slipped out of his mouth before he was aware of it. He was only trying to temporize. City caution told him that this was blackmail and that it is fatal to yield to a blackmailer. He also realized at the back of his mind that he most certainly had not in the house at that moment enough ready money to satisfy her. And he was not going to give her a check, not he. So he said no, really meaning yes, and had he not been so dull-witted that morning he would have bitten his tongue out rather than have said it. Marguerite condescended to use a threat or two. "That is a pity," she said, "for I must have my freedom. If I were to tell my husband one or two little things, he would set me free, do you not think so? But it would cost you much money, more than what I have stooped to ask you. And your wife, she would not like that to happen, would she? She does not know at present, eh? If you would like her to." Marble's face turned from pale to flushed and back again to pallor. The stab had gone home. Anything rather than let Annie know. Annie held the key of his life in her hand. She had guessed his secret, he was sure of it. The knowledge had troubled him little up to the moment. She had been a cipher in his life for so long that he had hardly cared, save that it had made it uncomfortable to meet her eyes. But if Annie were to know of this? His drink-dazed mind realized for the first time how desperately necessary it was that Annie should be kept in a good humor. The terror in his breast made him lose control over himself. "All right, I'll pay you," he said. "How much is it?" He had cut the ground from under his feet. He had shown her which was the best course of action. He had shown her how much he feared Annie's knowing. By his earlier refusal and later hurried agreement, he had delivered himself over bound and naked to his enemy. Marguerite laughed a little, a malicious, throaty laugh. Then she spoke, mentioning the sum quite as if it were a matter of course. £300. I can't afford all that." The surprise in Mr. Marble's voice was obvious and genuine, but Marguerite was quick-witted enough to see that he really could afford the huge sum. £300, she said again. "But I haven't got all that in the house, and a check. It is a check that I want," said Madame Collins grimly, and seeing him still hesitate for a moment she added, "And your wife will be back soon, will she not?" Marble went over to the gilt bureau and wrote out the check. She was just reclasping her handbag when they heard Annie Marble's key in the door. When she entered the room, Marble was the one that was obviously discomposed. She herself was honey-sweet as usual, calm and self-possessed. "I have come to say goodbye," she said. "Tomorrow I go to France." "To France?" "Yes, I am going to have a holiday. I am sorry that you were out when I came, for I have so much to do that I fear I cannot stay." No, really I cannot. "Goodbye, dear Mrs. Marble. I will send you a postcard from Rouen." With that she was gone. It was rather a pity that Mr. Marble should have been so obviously anxious to get rid of her. Why, she herself was most anxious to be out of the house too, so that she could hurry and cash that check before Marble could stop it, if by chance he recovered his spirits enough to do anything like that, but she showed no signs of it at all. It was perfectly true that at the time Mrs. Marble did not notice her husband's nervousness, but little things like that, as time had already shown, had a way of staying in Mrs. Marble's memory and re-emerging at inconvenient moments. After Madame Collins' departure, Mr. Marble eyed his wife anxiously. He had realized now that she was a person of immense importance to his affairs, and, what was more, that she was, after all, someone who might, should it so happen, act independently. He had grown so used all his life to regarding her as the very reverse of a free agent, as obedient to himself almost as one of his own limbs, that the reflection that she might not be so startled him. There was only one thing, Marble knew, that would make her break out contrary to his wishes, but that was the least accountable of all factors. If Annie got to know that he had been unfaithful to her, if she had it forced home upon her that his love for her, if ever it had existed, and it had in her imagination, which was all that mattered, was dead, then she would be capable of doing the most unexpected things. She would not deliberately betray him, not even terror-maddened Marble thought that, but she might in her consternation allow something to escape her that would set in action that swarm of rumors and the resultant investigation that Mr. Marble so dreaded. It was of the first importance that she should continue to think he loved her. And the fact that he endowed this circumstance with its full importance was directly due to Madame Collins. At the moment he felt almost grateful to the latter for showing him this. But he eyed his wife anxiously, for all that. It was an added complication, and the burden of his troubles was already almost more than he could bear. And yet perhaps, although Mr. Marble did not appreciate it, this new complication was for the time at least a blessing in disguise. It took Mr. Marble's mind off the main point of his troubles, and that was more than anything else had done during the last year. The situation reacted upon him in such a way that for 24 hours, Mr. Marble hardly drank any whiskey at all. But it was one thing to decide to make oneself agreeable to one's wife, and quite another to carry it out. Mr. Marble felt positively embarrassed as he eyed his wife and tried to brace himself for action. He had lived with her in the closest proximity and yet in the harshest isolation for a year now. It would be a difficult matter to break the ice and start afresh. Besides, there lay between them the shadow of a terrible secret. That might serve to bind them closer together later on, but at present it was an obstacle almost insurmountable. Not all that day, not that night, not the next day did Mr. Marble make much progress. He made no progress in his own estimation, that is to say. 36 hours after deciding upon this course of action, Mr. Marble still felt almost shy and almost embarrassed in his wife's presence. But Mrs. Marble had noticed something. First and foremost, of course, she noticed that he was not drunk. That was obvious. This temperance was partly deliberate and partly reflex, dependent on Mr. Marble's knowledge that it would be as well to keep his head clear and to appear as attractive in his wife's eyes as possible. But partly it was due to the fact that, with this new problem to think about, Mr. Marble had no thought to spare for his other troubles and, consequently, no need to dull his mind to them. But Mrs. Marble noticed more than his soberness. She caught him repeatedly looking at her with an anxious air, the same manner as a courting lover might display. And he made one or two tentative attempts at conversation with her too. Seeing that he had said nothing to her for months save the one or two words that had to be said, this was an enormous difference. He looked at her, he spoke to her, with a shyness that set her fluttering, and more than once he opened his mouth as though to say something to her, and then held back at the last minute, obviously embarrassed. Mrs. Marble felt strangely pleased. After all, dear Will was her whole life, especially now that John was no longer with her, and, secret or no secret, this new wooing in this strange shy fashion was grateful to her and gave her a warm, comforted feeling. It was the evening after Madame Collins' visit that it really began over again. They were sitting together in the back room, trying to talk, when Collins himself called. Mrs. Marble brought him in. He was a frail, pale, fair man, and he looked white and faggied. He sat down on the chair offered him with a sigh. "I've come to see if you know anything about my wife," he said wearily. "What, Marguerite?" "Why, yes, she was here yesterday. She said she was just off for a holiday." "Where was it she said she was going to, Will?" "Normandy, of course," said Marble. He wanted to appear to know as little as possible about the business. "I thought as much," sighed Collins. Neither of the Marbles spoke, and after a moment Collins went on, "She's gone. I suppose she's gone for good." I don't know whether she's gone alone, though." "But didn't she say where she was going?" Mrs. Marble was quite irrepressible this evening, as a result of her husband's flattering attentions. "No, I didn't know that she was going. She took good care of that. She has taken everything with her." "Everything?" Mrs. Marble did not understand. "Everything. All our savings she's taken. All her own things, too. There's even a bill of sale on the furniture I found this morning." Collins was resting his forehead on his hands. "She went yesterday," he added inconsequently. The Marbles felt the uselessness of trying to console him. No word was said for a space. Then Collins stood up and reached for his hat. He hesitated for a second. "I'm sorry to have troubled you," he said, weakly. "But I just wanted to know." Then, in a little spurt of feeling, he added, "It's hateful to have to ask other people about my own wife. But I didn't want her to go. I didn't want her to go." He almost broke down, but turned away and began to stumble to the door. Marble followed him. Half-heartedly, but in a man-of-the-world tone, he offered his help. "If there's anything I can do, Collins." "I don't think there is," said Collins feebly. "Money?" "No, I won't want money." It was she who wanted money. Collins was feeling his way blindly, weakly, down the passage. His shoulders drooped. Clearly, he was quite broken down by the desertion of his wife, much more than Marble had expected. It became obvious that Marguerite's tales of their unhappiness together had been one-sided. "Well, if there is anything I can do," said Marble again. It was the inevitable feeble proffer of help, and Collins declined it once more. Then he went out into the night with dragging feet, hardly able to walk. There were tears in Mrs. Marble's eyes when Marble came back to her in the sitting room. "Poor man," said she. Marble nodded. "And what a hateful woman she must be," she went on. "I thought the first time I saw her that she was, well, you know, like that." Mrs. Marble had not thought anything of the kind, but she thought she did, after the event. "Poor old Collins seems broken up about it," was Marble's comment. "He must have loved her a lot. Poor chap. And she's gone now and left him alone. Hateful woman." The tears were even more imminent in her eyes now, as she stood by him, and there was a strange surge of emotion in her breast. Marble looked at her queerly. Both their hearts were throbbing tumultuously. "You wouldn't do a thing like that, would you?" said Marble, his hands playing with her sleeves. Annie looked up at his face for a second. Only a second. "Oh, how could I? Oh, Will, dear." There was no more need for words. But as Marble kissed her, her cheeks were wet, too. By now, he felt a queer, guilty sensation internally. And yet he meant that kiss, he really did. Perhaps Judas felt the same once. Chapter 14. And so, incredible as it might seem, sunshine had come again for a space to 53 Malcolm Road. The black pall of terror was lifted, and Annie Marble actually went singing in her high, cracked voice up and down the stairs as she did her housework. Not one word had passed between them concerning the shade of terrible danger that brooded over them, but now that each knew, and had shown that they could bear with the knowledge, the shade did not seem so black. It was a trouble shared, and a trouble shared voluntarily is a trouble robbed of half its weight. Singing, Annie Marble went up and down the stairs. Marble, sitting downstairs, could hear her thin voice and her light step. For the present the voice did not call up a scowl to his brow, nor did the step seem too stealthy to be tolerated, as once it did. Whiskey had lost its savor for the time being. There was no pressing need for it to dull his mind. Most of the time Marble's mouth was twisted with a queer smile, and he had not smiled for months, as he thought of the difference his taking notice of his wife had made. He was glad of it, too, and now he could not think of his wife without that smile. He felt glad and comforted as he thought of her. Her present high spirits might be pathetic, they might even seem a trifle ridiculous, but they were, nevertheless, infectious. Within Mr. Marble's bosom there was a fondness, almost a fatherly fondness, springing up for the woman who loved him so well. And, estimating gains from the most sordid point of view, it was a distinct advantage that he should have in the house a willing ally upon whom he could rely and who was possessed of sufficient knowledge of the facts of the case to help him should emergency arise. Mr. Marble was even able occasionally to throw off his obsession completely and leave the house and the garden to his wife's care while he went forth through the dingy streets for exercise. The straggling rays of spring sunshine seemed to warm him at a time when other people were hurrying along clasping their heavy coats to themselves in the bitter cold, and he blinked at the sunlight gratefully with house-blinded eyes. As for Annie Marble, she was a changed woman. She could sing about the house. The housework seemed nothing to her nowadays, so comforting was the knowledge that darling Will was downstairs thinking about her. She routed out from some neglected kitchen shelf a stained copy of Mrs. Beeton, a wedding gift, unlooked at since she first had 2 children on her hands, 16 years ago, and labored joyously, though rarely successfully, compounding new delicacies for her beloved lord. For now there was no pinch for money, and Annie had found 16 years ago that if one wanted to cook in the style of Mrs. Beeton there was a great need of money. And the will had to be there too. So the evenings often found her sitting laboriously composing notes to the big stores, ordering all sorts of strange things, things which she had never thought of ordering before: bottled oysters, asparagus, foie gras. Queer lists for which Mr. Marble signed the checks without a murmur. He felt that at last he was beginning to have some benefit from the money he had won at such risk during his slavery at the bank. It was the first time. And Mrs. Marble's personal expenses, too, began to show a healthy increase. She did not venture up to Bond Street again. That was asking too much of her. She could not face the immense superiority of the young ladies in those shops. Even High Street, Kensington, was a little above her head, but in Rye Lane she was exceedingly happy. The shops therein arrogantly called it the Regent Street of South London in their advertisements, and they did their level best to live up to the boast. Mrs. Marble's frail little figure and her witless face, made almost pretty by reason of her happiness, became well known there. She would flit around the big shops, ordering here, trying on there, within her manner a little trace of apology for troubling the assistants, for all her money. For her it was one of the very keenest of enjoyments, so keen that it almost hurt, to buy things, anything she liked, without having to think about the cost. But always she would stop in the middle of her shopping and hurry anxiously to catch a bus to get home in case her darling Will was growing anxious about her. Yet this happiness, this moment of peace, was only a lull in the storm. They were both conscious of this, although they never admitted it even to themselves. And, because they would not admit it, they were still handicapped in their relations with each other. Annie found this one morning when she came home from Rye Lane and found Marble sitting spiritless in his chair in the sitting room, in almost the same way as he had sat in the dark days gone by. There was a cloud on his brow, she could tell that at once. But she tried to act naturally. She came fluttering up to him with all her parcels, dropped the latter carelessly on the table, and bent over him and kissed him lightly, spontaneously, a trick she had never mastered before, not even in the honeymoon days. "I've got back, you see," said she. It was just the sort of thing one would expect her to say, and because of this it ought to have called up an instant smile. It would have done so yesterday. But today there was no smile. Marble's set, dull look frightened her. It was so like the look he had worn in the bad time. A little shudder ran through her, as she realized that it was calling up within her the same sensations, as though they were echoes, that she had known during the same period. A light had gone out in the world. "What's the matter, dear?" she said. Aren't you well?" That was all she could say, because of the barrier still between them. She could not very well say, "Is your conscience troubling you? Or are you still afraid of detection?" And Marble could only answer dully, "Oh, I'm all right," and put her aside rather abashed and frightened. He could not tell her that what he had foreseen had happened, that by the second post, happily after she had gone out, there had arrived a letter from Rouen, a cruel, bitter letter, delicately phrased and worded, apparently telling him of the writer's unbounded affection for him, but really only a sneering demand for money, more money. The actual cash did not matter so much. Marble had enough and to spare to keep even Marguerite Collins quiet. No, it was not the money. It was, although he did not allow himself to believe it, the fact that the letter had brought back into his life what had been for a moment absent, the sense of hideous insecurity, the knowledge that the future was laden with all sorts of ghastly possibilities, and had once more set his mind running on the things that might happen. Marble started drinking heavily again that day. He could hardly be blamed for so doing. Yet for all that he roused himself the next morning sufficiently to go into town. He cashed a check, and with the money he went into an exchange bureau and bought many dirty 100-franc notes, which he put into a registered envelope and dispatched it to Rouen. It was in this fashion that the old atmosphere redeveloped at 53 Malcolm Road. It grew slowly, and the young friendship died hard, but the one grew and the other died, inevitably, infallibly. And the passionate love that Annie bore to Marble, the love that he had roused, was beaten down and trampled underfoot. Passion she had known before, in a vague sort of way, when they had first been married, and love she had always borne him, but the new love, this splendid, brilliant thing that had just come into her life, born of trouble shared with him, and which for this space had illuminated her whole being, was changed to poison and bitterness. It was bad for both of them. The effect was not yet well marked by the time Easter came, bringing back Winnie from school. She had changed, just as she had changed during the other 2 terms. She was taller, she nearly overtopped her father now, and she was more beautiful than ever. Her manner had changed, too. She had gained in assurance, it might be better put as insolence, and her voice had gained in its marked throaty quality. Her complexion was wonderful and her figure was marvelous. Her upper lip was short and her eyelids drooping, and she carried herself with an easy erectness that accentuated the arrogance of her manner. She was head girl of the school now, thanks to a capacity for producing good results in examinations without doing much work beforehand, and thanks also to an unexpected flair for lacrosse and for tennis. She was not the sort of girl to stand any nonsense from old-fashioned parents, not by a long chalk. At first things did not go too badly. Matters had not declined very much from the old standard of perfection that they had reached during the good time that had just ended. Winnie's drooping eyelids lifted a trifle in surprise the first lunchtime, when she saw the spotless white cloth and the bright silver, and was given a lunch not very inferior either in quality or quantity to that she was given at school. But the brief spell of intimacy her parents had enjoyed had left an unfortunate legacy behind it. They could quarrel now, which was more than they had been able to do before, and they rather took advantage of it. The disappointment of the decline of their happiness rasped their nerves, and they displayed a distressing tendency to snap at one another, which Winnie deprecated. It was rank bad form for husband and wife to quarrel in public. Winnie considered that her presence was sufficient to make the quarrels take place in public. Behind the wrinkle in Winnie's brow many things were slowly developing. She liked to think of herself as cold-blooded and calculating. Calculating she may have been, cold-blooded she certainly was not. She could weigh up chances and make a plan of campaign, but she never chose the cautious plan indicated by those chances. Winnie's cold-bloodedness amounted to an ability to see the folly of recklessness combined with an inability to avoid being reckless. First of all, she was cautious. She refitted her wardrobe to the fullest extent she could possibly contrive. Her father paid the bills without a murmur. He still could take delight in the fact that his daughter was at school with 2 honorables, daughters of a profiteering war peer, and that during the last holidays she had met several other titled people to speak to. He did not object in the least to paying for her clothes under these circumstances. Even while Winnie was studying spring fashions, she found herself smiling wryly with relief that her parents had this queer fad for living in a pokey house in a pokey suburb. If they had launched out a bit when they had made their money, as once she had wanted them to, there would not be all this loose cash to throw about. $1,200 a year was not much. If they had a big house and a motor car, her father would certainly not be able to pay $300 a year for her school expenses, nor these big sums for her clothes, and as for the check she had just wheedled out of him, well, he would have thought more than twice about giving her that. Winnie was acutely aware of the atmosphere of insecurity that hung like a fog about 53 Malcolm Road. Of its true cause she was, of course, ignorant, but she appreciated it sufficiently to do her best to make hay while the sun still shone. She had plenty of clothes, and she had a monstrous sum in her handbag, an amount undreamed of by her schoolfellows and most certainly unknown to her schoolmistresses. For all the fact that it was a school for profiteers' daughters, there would have been a huge commotion if it had got about that Winnie Marble habitually carried over £100, a bulky roll of 5 and 10-pound notes with her. But Winnie was cautious so far, she took pains that it did not get about. Money was always useful, and at the back of Winnie's mind there was a half-formed plan, in carrying out which she would find it more than useful, she expected. Last holiday had been most successful. The girl she had stayed with had, of course, been only a girl, and the other guests who came at odd intervals had hardly noticed her. But they noticed Winnie all right. It would have been hard not to. Winnie, to the annoyance of her hostess and the chagrin of the daughter of the house, had climbed into the position of full guest. She attained brevet woman's rank and clung to it like a leech. The other women had turned up their noses. The men had grinned and played up to her. And 2 of the men were likely to be useful to Winnie if ever she decided to act on that half-formed plan. They were powers in the world of musical comedy, maybe because they, too, were war profiteers. But for all that, it was a little inconvenient that she was not to be asked to that house again. She would be glad to have somewhere to go this holiday. If she had, the storm might perhaps have been averted, perhaps everything might have been different. As it was, the eventual catastrophe was impossible to avoid. It began in quite a small way, the way these things do. "Oh, Mother," said Winnie, "you're never going out in that hat?" "Why not?" asked Mrs. Marble. She had never liked the way Winnie had dismissed, with a bare word, all the fine clothes she had been buying. "It's too awful for words. That red and that blue, it was unfortunate that she should have said that." The hat was one whose trimming Mrs. Marble had altered herself, and she was proud of the result. "I think it's very nice," said Mrs. Marble. "Oh, it's not, Mother. Those colors swear at each other most frightfully. Oh, dear, and your coat's all wrinkled at the back. Why don't you learn to put your clothes on properly?" "I do put them on properly. I put them on better than you do. I don't look fast." The last words slipped out almost without Mrs. Marble being aware of them. She felt sore and irritable, and it had been a tradition in her family when she was a little girl that everyone who had the self-assured manner and polished appearance that Winnie affected was fast. Winnie did not mind being called fast by her mother. She only deigned to reply with a rather unladylike snort. But the word attracted her father's attention, and he looked up sharply. He was irritable, too. "Don't talk to your mother like that, Winnie," he said. "Don't interfere," snapped Winnie. She gave a last wrench at the wrinkled coat, but she was cross, and the coat was a hopeless misfit anyway. Mrs. Marble staggered at the wrench. Winnie had meant nothing by it, but it brought Mr. Marble to his feet. "Be careful, my girl," he said. It was that "my girl" which settled the matter. It was a horridly vulgar expression, and it took Winnie straight back to those dark days before she had ever gone to school in Berkshire. She turned and looked at her father, looked him up and down, and as she could find nothing to say, she did something far more effective than any speech would have been. She turned away without a word spoken, her upper lip a little curled. Not much, that was the annoying part. It implied that her father was not worth being too contemptuous about, and her best young ladyish expression on her face. It was more than flesh and blood could stand, especially flesh and blood that had been moistened by just not enough whiskey for the last few days. Marble caught her by the shoulder and swung her round again. "One word from you, my girl," he said, "and you'll be sorry. You're not grown up yet, you know." "Aren't I?" said Winnie. "Aren't I? I'll show you that I am in a minute, if you're not careful," she added, manners clean forgotten, "you and your silly old house, and your silly old furniture, and your silly old clothes. Just look at you both." She looked them up and down again, both of them this time. It was here that Mrs. Marble should have played the peacemaker. It was her last opportunity, and she might have flung herself between her husband and her daughter. But she was too cross, partly because she knew that Winnie's sneer at the furniture would have hit her husband in a tender spot. "Oh, you wicked girl," she said. "How dare you speak to us like that? You ought to be grateful to us for all we've done for you." Winnie could think of nothing better to say than "ought I," but it was quite enough for her to say. It was the manner and not the matter that told. Winnie was too superior altogether, and that throaty accent of hers irritated her parents past all bearing. It reminded her father too painfully of the days when he had been a slave in a bank, and it forced home upon her mother the knowledge that her criticism of her clothes had been sincere, and it gave her an uncomfortable feeling that Winnie knew what she was talking about. It was Mrs. Marble that found speech first. "Yes, you did ought," she said. "You owe us the clothes on your back, and all that fine schooling you've had, and everything else. So there." Winnie had lost her temper thoroughly by now. "I do I?" she said. "Well, I shan't owe you anything else, so there. I'll go away now, this minute, if you're not careful. I will, I tell you." She may have thought that this threat would be sure of silencing them and making them sorry for what they had said, but she had left out of her reckoning the temper they were in, and the fact that they might not take her literally. Nor was she to know that there was one member in the house who might not be too sorry if she were to carry out her threat, someone who found it very worrying to have to guard his own backyard from his own daughter. "Pooh," said Mr. Marble. "I will, I tell you. I will." "Oh, And then Winnie stamped her foot at them as they stood there and turned and fled upstairs to her own room. Downstairs, they heard the key turn in the lock. Oh dear, said Mrs. Marble, now that it was over. I'll go up to her, shall I? No, said Marble, she's only gone to have a good cry. Didn't you hear her lock her door? But Winnie was not having a good cry. She had made her decision in red-hot mood, with a precipitation after her calm deliberation that was characteristic of her. She dragged out her trunks from under her bed and began to pile her clothes into them feverishly. It was all done before she had time to think. Then she washed her face in cold water and repowdered carefully. Now that her mind was made up, there was nothing that could change it. She put on her hat, her very nicest hat, before the mirror and walked downstairs again. Before her mother could come out into the hall to make her peace, she had gone out, with the front door slamming behind her. Gone for a walk, was Marble's terse explanation when his wife tearfully reported this to him. Gone for a walk to get over it. She'll come back soon as right as rain. She was back sooner than they expected, however, and she came back in a cab. They heard her key in the door, and a moment afterwards they heard her directing the cab driver upstairs to where her trunks lay. As the true import of this came home to her, Mrs. Marble hurried into the hall, wringing her hands. Winnie, Winnie, she wailed. We didn't mean it, really we didn't. Winnie, dear, don't go like this. Will, tell her she mustn't. But Mr. Marble was silent. Winnie had come into the sitting room to them, defiance in her eyes. They could hear the labored steps of the cab driver bringing down the first trunk. Will, tell her she mustn't, said Mrs. Marble again. But Mr. Marble still said nothing. He was drumming with his fingers upon the arm of his chair. He was thinking, as hard as his confused mind and the tumult of his thoughts would allow. There was absolutely no denying the fact that it would be more convenient to have Winnie out of the house. One never knew, never. All the books said that it was the little things that gave one away, and the fewer people there were about to notice such things, the better. Perhaps Mr. Marble would not have considered this in connection with Winnie, but during that quarrel there was something that forced it upon him. Once more it was that dread family likeness. Winnie had looked rather like John, that time when he had come blundering into the sitting room, and she had looked rather like young Medland, too. It had shaken him badly. The heavy steps of the cab driver were heard redescending the stairs. They paused outside the door, and he coughed apologetically. 2 trunks and a 'at box, Mum. Is that right? Quite right, said Winnie, in her throatiest, most musical voice. And still Mr. Marble said nothing. Goodbye, said Winnie. The throatiness disappeared like magic. There was a little break in her voice. It would have taken very little to have diverted her from her purpose. Mrs. Marble looked at her husband, waited for him to speak. All she could do was to wring her hands and choke in her breathing. Still Mr. Marble did not speak. Winnie could bear it no longer. She swung round on her heel and ran out of the room, down the hall and out to the waiting cab. Charing Cross, she said to the driver, huskily. Mrs. Marble only reached the gate when they were 50 yards away, beyond recall. It was all very stupid and silly, and afterwards it seemed as if it might have been avoided, but it really might not. Chapter 15. And now began the darkest period in all Annie Marble's unhappy life, the last few weeks before its unhappy end. The shadows had massed about 53 Malcolm Road, and as they clustered round ready for the last act of the tragedy, poor Annie grew more and more conscious of their presence. Winnie was gone, of that they could be sure now. They had waited a week in suspense, then they had begun to advertise for her. Discreet little advertisements in the personal columns of the papers. Winnie. Come back to 53. Everything forgiven. Father and mother. That was the most they could do. For a brief half-second, while they had been debating what to do, there had arisen a hint that they might call in the police, but it vanished at once like a breath of cold air, leaving them looking dumbly at each other without meeting each other's eyes. Poor Annie spent anxious hours wondering what had happened to her daughter. There was only one thing that she thought possible, and that was that she was leading a life of shame with one or other of the finely dressed men she knew. At this late period, Annie remembered the flocks of men who had hovered, and more than hovered, about them during those days at the Grand Pavilion Hotel. She was sure that it was this that had happened. Neither she nor her husband knew that Winnie had had all that money with her when she left, Nor, thinking the worst as they inevitably did they give her credit for her coolness of head that she could summon to her aid if necessary. Annie Marble thought she had driven her daughter into prostitution. It was the bitterest drop she had to swallow. It was spring, and drifting through the air came the plague. Perhaps it was the selfsame plague that had swept across England during the last years of the reign of Edward III, certainly the same plague that had killed its thousands in war-torn France in 1814 and claimed the life of an empress. The same plague that had decimated Europe the last spring of the war, taking more victims than had the war itself. The same plague that, sometimes virulent, sometimes almost negligible, had shown itself every spring since. The disease at which some people still scoff, but which is, nevertheless, deadly, influenza. It was in the air and seeking victims. Those who troubled too little about their health, those who were for the moment out of sorts, those who were depressed or worn with anxiety, they were the victims the plague sought. And Annie Marble was depressed and worn with anxiety. She was fretting about Winnie, and this was the last straw added to the intolerable burden under which she labored. Will had returned almost entirely to his old ways. Once again he passed his time in the sitting room, peering drearily through the windows into the backyard. The whiskey bottle was continually at his side. The words he had for his wife grew fewer and fewer. Sometimes he could still rouse himself sufficiently to pay her a little attention and bring a flash of sunshine into her life, but the occasions were rare. Poor Annie. Then one morning Annie was not well. She had a headache and she was thirsty. At first she was able to let it pass unheeded. It would go away during the morning, she thought, or at least it would be gone by tomorrow. So she began her day's work, but when it was half completed she felt that she had to sit and rest for a space. The rest seemed to do her good, and she thought to complete the cure by going out to do her shopping. She put on her coat and hat, but even as she went downstairs dizziness came over her, and she was forced to acknowledge herself beaten. With an effort of will she went into the sitting room, where her husband was staring gloomily through the panes. "Will," she said, collapsing into a chair, "I don't feel very well." That roused her husband a little, to ask what he could do, and what was the matter. It ended in Mr. Marble going forth to do the shopping, leaving her to rest. It was tacitly understood between them, before he left her, that she was to rest in the sitting room, whence she could keep an eye through the windows. And the next day Annie felt worse than ever. But even in her illness she found something to comfort her. Marble was a little alarmed, and he showed it in the concern he evinced about her. He asked how she was very gently, and he tried to minister to her in a clumsy man's fashion. Poor Annie was quite flustered and pleased, despite her sickness, by the attention he paid her. As he guided her to a chair and propped her back with cushions where it hurt, and asked what else he could do, she was almost glad she was ill. For she had refused to stay in bed. That was like her. If she could stand, she would get out of bed. And she could not only stand, but she could walk, when her dizziness permitted it. She was in a high fever, but to that she did not pay much attention. But she agreed, nevertheless, that it might perhaps be advisable that Will should do the shopping that day. He even volunteered that he should, and sallied out, shopping basket in hand, and a little list of things that were needed. He had forgotten 1 or 2 items the day before. While he was gone, Annie sat in the drawing room. Her mouth was dry, and there was an unpleasant taste in it, and her head felt queer, and there was a strange sort of doubtfulness about things when she looked at them. There were pains in her body and joints, too. But for all that, she still felt the joy of her husband's loving attention. But Will had hardly gone when the postman dropped a letter through the door with his double knock. It was the 11 o'clock postman, he who brought the continental mail. Annie walked weakly to the door and picked up the letter, and went back weakly to the drawing room. Not until she had sat down did she look at the envelope. She was not sure enough of her legs to read it standing up. But she was very interested as to what it might be. For perhaps it might be news of Winnie. The envelope was addressed most queerly. The writing was large and sprawling. The first letter of the address was a big A. The second was an M. The third was a W. The letter was obviously from foreign parts, for the address ended Angleterre, and Annie knew that meant England in a foreign tongue. Thus, A. M. W. Marble, 53, Malcolm Road, Dulwich, Londres, Angleterre. Annie looked at the envelope a long time. Clearly the and the M referred to her. Was she not and Mary Marble? The W and the absence of any Mrs. bothered her. But it might be usual in letters from abroad to leave out the Mrs., and being from abroad it might contain news about Winnie just as much as if it had been posted in England. Annie opened it and took out the letter. It took several seconds for the import of the first few words to pierce home to her, but as soon as she had grasped their meaning, she sank back half fainting in her chair. The letter was in English, and it began, "My dearest, darling Will." Recovering herself, Annie read the remainder of the letter. She could not understand some of it. The cruel satire of it was beyond her, dulled as her mind was by her fever, and what she did understand left her heartbroken. All through the letter the writer addressed Will in terms of the most flamboyant affection. It made some reference, which she did not understand, to her, Annie, and it ended by asking for money. "The same as you sent me before, darling." Annie sat still, the letter crumpled up in her hand. There was no address on the letter, and the signature was rather illegible and consisted of a French word. But she knew from whom the letter came. It might have been instinct, or it might have been recognition of the style, but she knew. The tears which might have helped her were denied her by the fever. All she could do was to sit and think distortedly over everything. So Will did not love her after all her dreams and hopes. Instead, he was writing to this Frenchwoman and sending her money. All this tenderness of his, and the passion he had shown a little while back, just after she had gone, Annie realized with a sob in her throat, were mere pretenses. With strange prescience, she guessed that it was to keep her in a good temper when he found that she knew about his secret. A half-formed resolution rose in the maelstrom of her thoughts that she would betray him at the first opportunity, but she put it aside unconsidered. She loved him too much. Her heart was broken, and she was very, very unhappy. She sat there all alone for what seemed like hours. Later came Marble, but she roused herself at the sound of the key in the door sufficiently to thrust the letter into the bosom of her dress, and when he came to ask how she was, she managed to gasp out, "I think I'm ill." Oh, then she fell forward in the chair. She was ill, very ill. Marble helped her up to bed, to the big gilt bed where the cupids climbed eternally, with its lavish canopy rail and bulging ornament. But when she had recovered sufficiently to undress, she thrust the letter into her little private drawer before calling to him in her cracked, fevered voice for his help. Next day she was worse. Marble bent over her anxiously as she lay there in the gaudy bed. She tossed about, from side to side, and she hardly knew him. There were only those two in the house, and he was worried. Worried to death. Of sick nursing he knew nothing. There was not even a clinical thermometer in the house. If she were to die, but he refused to consider her dying. There would be one fewer in the secret, it is true, but the disadvantages would be overwhelming. And there would be questions asked if she were to die without receiving medical attention. Come what might, he must fetch a doctor. He must bring a stranger into his house, the house that he guarded so urgently. There was no help for it at all. He saw that she had all his intelligence could suggest that she might want, and then slipped away quietly downstairs and out to where the nearest brass plate hung at a gate. A white-capped maidservant took his message and told him that the doctor would be round shortly. Dr. Atkinson was a thin rat of a man, with sandy hair and eyebrows, neither young nor old, with a keen glance behind his pince-nez. He felt her pulse, took her temperature. He noticed her troubled breathing and the way she tossed and turned in the bed. She was nearly delirious. Indeed, her speech was confused, and twice she muttered something that he just did not catch. He turned and looked keenly at Marble. "Who's looking after her?" he asked. "I am," said Marble, a trifle sullenly, Atkinson thought, later. "Are you alone?" "Yes. My daughter's away at present." "Well, you'd better get somebody in. Some neighbor or somebody. She'll need careful attention if we're to avoid pneumonia." Marble looked at him blankly. "Get somebody in? Have someone else in the house, poking and prying about? And Annie there, nearly delirious." Marble had caught a word or two of what she had muttered, of what Atkinson had not heard, and it set him trembling. Atkinson was looking round the room, with its queer furnishing of gilt. He was trying to estimate the income of this man who apparently did not go to work. "What about a nurse?" he said. "I'll send one in, shall I?" Marble found his tongue. "No," he said, with overmuch vehemence. He was sadly overtried. "I won't have a nurse. I can do all the nursing myself. I won't have a nurse." Atkinson shrugged his shoulders. "Well, if you won't, you won't. But she'll need very careful nursing, I tell you that. You must," he went on to outline all that Marble must do. But all the time he was debating within himself over this strange man who lived alone with his wife in a poky house furnished like Buckingham Palace, whose daughter was away, at present, who did no work, and who was violently opposed to having anyone nurse his wife. And Marble guessed at his curiosity, and cursed at it within himself, with the sweat running cold under his clothes. "Right, I'll look in again this afternoon," said Atkinson. He did. He looked in again twice a day during all the next week. And during that week Marble fretted and wore himself to pieces under the burden of all his troubles. Everything was madly worrying. Atkinson alone, with his sharp eyes everywhere, was enough to madden him, yet to add to it all the great worry of his life returned to him and nagged at him more than ever he had known it before. Marble found his harassed mind returning continually to work out hateful possibilities, whether or not Atkinson might find something out, whether he had heard anything of what Annie was continually muttering, what the neighbors, as well as Atkinson, thought of his refusing to call in the assistance of anyone else. He knew that they were all interested in what went on in his house. He knew how they sneered enviously at all his fine possessions, and at Annie's clothes and Winnie's grand manner, and they were probably burningly interested in what had happened to Winnie, though by good luck they might think she was still at school. Annie herself worried him, too. She was a difficult patient. She would hardly speak to him, and would turn from him in horror on those occasions when she was most nearly delirious. She needed a great deal of attention. Marble had to struggle to do invalid cookery for her, he, who had never so much as touched a saucepan in his life. He had to do it well, too, for that brute Atkinson was continually coming in, and more than once he demanded to see and taste the concoctions he had prepared for her. Marble struggled along with Mrs. Beeton, the same Mrs. Beeton as Annie had lingered over for his sake, and attended to the tradesmen who once more came calling. Marble had to allow that. Atkinson was too sharp for him to attempt to do the shopping and leave his patient. Rushing from the kitchen to the door, and from the door to the bedroom, whenever Annie rang the handbell that stood by the bed, and from the bedroom back to the kitchen, Marble wore himself out. It was rare that even 2 attempts brought success to his unskillful cookery. He seemed to be cooking all the time. And as a crowning worry came the fear that he would be taken ill, too. In that case Atkinson, the interfering busybody, would step in and have them taken away to hospital. If he were delirious like Annie, he shuddered at the thought. So it was wildly necessary that he should retain his health. Marble had never worried about his health before, but now he paid for it in full. He took his temperature every few minutes, he studied his body attentively, and he stopped drinking the whiskey for which his nerves shrieked. The strain told on him. The worrying days and the broken nights, for he had to attend to Annie frequently during the nights, broke his already strained nerves to pieces. And he could not forget about the garden. That was continuously in his thoughts, too. If anything, it was worse now. Marble found himself, whenever the jangle of Annie's bell roused him out of his sleep, and after he had done what she wanted, creeping downstairs to peer out into the dark garden to see that all was secure. He even began to wake on his own during the night and go down, and he had never done that before. Strange to tell, Annie recovered. It was more really than Atkinson expected, and it seems stranger still when it is remembered that she did not want to recover. For she did not. Annie wanted to die, but she recovered. The fever left her, very thin, very pale, with the shining pallor of the invalid, and she was able to leave off the pneumonia jacket that Marble had hurriedly contrived, and sit up in bed dressed in one of her opulent, overlaced night-dresses and a dressing jacket and boudoir cap. Atkinson told Marble that she was not yet quite out of danger. There was always a risk after a bad attack of influenza. There might be grave heart trouble, or even now pneumonia might intervene if she were to get up too soon. But, of course, said Atkinson, there's not much chance of her getting up for a bit yet. She's too weak to stand at present. Annie lay in bed, thinking. She was thinking with the clearness of thought, harsh and raw as a winter's morning that comes after a period of high fever. Over her brooded the dreadful depression following influenza, the poisonous depression which darkens the most hopeful outlook. And Annie's outlook was anything but hopeful. Downstairs, she could hear her husband moving about on one of his endless household tasks, and her lips writhed at the thought of him. She did not hate him, she could not hate him, even now. But she felt she hated herself. And she had lost her husband's love, the love which for a brief space had made the whole world seem a wonderful place. Looking ahead, as far as she was able to look ahead, she could see nothing to hope for. She was tormented by the hideous knowledge of what lay in the barren flower bed in the backyard. The whole future held out no promise for her. She would have faced the peril that hung over her husband, and over herself as well, she realized, gladly, had she only been sure that her husband wished her to do so. But instead, she was only sure of the opposite. He would be glad to have her out of the way, and she would be glad to be out of the way. That set her thoughts moving swiftly on another tack. It might be easy enough. But if only she had died during this illness. She tried to piece together in her mind what that book of wills had said about the stuff. The stuff that still stood on the locked shelves in the bathroom. Death is practically instantaneous. Death is practically instantaneous. That meant an easy death, a quick death. There would be no trouble about it, none at all. Oh, it would be the best way. That clearness of thought was in evidence at present. Will was downstairs, and he was unlikely to disturb her for some time. It could be done, and better do it now, and save trouble, save trouble. Annie threw off the bedclothes and set her feet to the floor. Even as she did so, she found how unsteady she was. The room seemed to swing round her in a great arc. She nearly fell to the floor, and she would have done had she not, by a vast effort, seized the bed and collapsed across it. It took several minutes for her to recover. She tried again, more tentatively, and again she had hard work to save herself from falling. She could not walk, that was certain. But that would not prevent her. Slowly, with infinite precaution, she lowered herself to the floor. Then she crawled across the floor towards the window. It was dreadfully hard work. She could only move slowly. The cold air and the coldness of the linoleum bit deep into her, and she shuddered as she moved. She reached the chest of drawers, and clutching the knobs she pulled herself to her feet, standing there swaying. It took several seconds for her to grow used to this position. Once she swayed dangerously, but her grip on the drawer knobs saved her. Then she pulled open one of the drawers and did what she had been wanting to do all through her illness. She pulled out the strange letter and read it through, as closely as her swimming eyes would allow. She was right. There was no hope for her in it. It began, "My dearest, darling Will," sure enough. Once again the satire was lost on her. She reeled as she stood. Then she thrust the letter back into the drawer and closed it. Somehow she was still able to think clearly. The next thing she wanted was the key. All Will's keys were on a ring on the dressing table. She had to crawl there to get them. Then she crawled, oh so slowly, out through the door to the bathroom. The effort of standing up again when she reached the shelves was almost too much for her, but she achieved it. She stood listening for a brief space, just to make sure that Will was still busy downstairs. It would never do for him to come up now and find her here. But it was all quiet. She could just hear him, pottering about in the kitchen. The key fitted easily, and she opened the glass door. There on the shelf, just as she had seen it so long ago, stood the bottle, potassium cyanide. She took it in her hand, fondled it, she almost smiled as she looked at it. On the edge of the bath stood one of her medicine glasses. She filled it half full, the neck of the bottle chattering on the rim of the glass, and replaced the bottle. As it stood there on the shelf, she tried to bow to it. She tried to say thank you to it. And she locked the shelf door again tidily. She stood hesitating for a space, holding on to the edge of the bath. She did not want to die here, in this cold place. She would much rather die in her splendid great bed with the cupids twined about it. It would be risky trying to get back, but she thought she would run the risk. Oh, but it was so hard. She crawled along the floor, pushing the medicine glass in front of her, the keys trailing by their ring from one finger. Very hard it was, but she succeeded in the end. She hardly spilt a drop on the way. The medicine glass stood on the floor beside the bed. It was as much as she could manage to pull herself half erect and fall across the bed. She had to lie and rest again after that. But now at last she was ready. She must make everything neat and tidy first. With fumbling fingers, she drew the bedclothes round her and set her boudoir cap straight and settled the lace at her throat. Then she leaned over the side of the bed and took the glass in her hand. There was no hesitation in her raising it to her lips. She drained it, and the glass fell from her fingers to the floor and rolled under the bed. But even now things went badly for her. That cyanide had been kept in solution for over a year, slowly reacting with itself and with the atmosphere. It was not an easy death, not a quick death. Chapter 16. Mr. Marble had just finished his preliminary morning's work when Dr. Atkinson's rat-tat-tat came at the door. "How is she this morning?" asked Atkinson as they went up the stairs together. "She seemed a little bit down when I was in with her last. But I haven't been up to her for some time," said Marble. They entered the room, where Annie lay in the big gilt bed, with the other gilt furniture blazing about her. She lay there in a natural attitude, and there was a trace of color in her cheeks. But there was something different, which flashed to Atkinson's trained eye the moment it rested on her. "She's dead," said Atkinson, moving forward. Marble was there before him, standing by the bed with his hands clasped in front of him. It is impossible to say whether he was moved or not. All that he was conscious of at the moment was that his heart was thumping and thudding within him the way it always did nowadays when anything unusual happened. It beat, and his hands shook with the vibrations. "Her heart, I suppose," said Atkinson, coming to the bedside. He might have spared Marble the technical details if only Marble had appeared upset. But Marble did not. He was too busy thinking. His mind had started racing away, as it always did, to the accompaniment of the thudding of his heart. He was working out all the details of how this change would affect him, what difference it would make to his chances of continuing to avoid detection. All he could do was to stare at the body while his hands shook and his face remained stolid. Clearly his thoughts were far away. With an effort he recalled himself. Suspicion. He must do all he could to avoid suspicion. He looked sidelong at Atkinson and caught Atkinson looking sidelong at him. He started and tried to appear concerned. Now up to that moment Atkinson had not had the least trace of suspicion, but that glance and that start set thoughts flooding into his mind. He bent over the body and noticed something else, something which roused him to the highest pitch of suspicion. "I must make a slight examination," he said. "Could you go downstairs and get me a spoon?" A silver spoon. Marble went without a word, like an ox to the slaughter. No sooner had he left the room than Atkinson sprang into activity. He tiptoed across to see that Marble was really gone, and then he hurried back. There was a trace of foam on the dead woman's lips. There was a trace of a faint odor. He glanced under the bed. A medicine glass lay there. He picked it up and looked at it. A little of the contents remained. Close examination of this made him certain. When Marble came back to the room, he was scribbling something on a sheet from his pocketbook. "I shall want this as well," he said. "Will you go and give this note to the boy in my car outside and ask him to go straight home for it?" Marble took it. The note was an order to the boy to fetch a policeman, but Marble did not know that. So they hanged William Marble for the murder of his wife. It was a simple case. They proved that she had died of cyanide poisoning, and they proved that Marble had cyanide in his possession. Dr. Atkinson swore that Annie Marble would be quite incapable of going into the bathroom to get it for herself. Everything else pointed towards the same end. He would not have a nurse for her, but had insisted on doing everything himself, against the urgent advice of his doctor. Neighbors came flocking in, eager to swear that there had been bad blood between Marble and his wife for a long time, and that they had often heard quarrels and cries. They even found downstairs a number of books on crime, and in one book on medical jurisprudence, the page where cyanide poisoning was discussed was much thumbed and dirty through constant study. And for a motive, well, they found in a drawer a letter from a woman that amply proved a motive. It was a letter that Marble knew nothing about, but no one believed him when he said so. In fact, Marble went down through history as an extraordinarily clumsy murderer. And Winnie inherited $1,200 a year.